Hi, my name is Greg Wilkins from Manly Yacht Club, and this is our second presentation on the racing rules of sailing. And in this presentation we're going to look at marks and obstructions. It's a bit of a long haul, lots of complexity in these rules. If you haven't looked at the previous presentation on rights and limitations, I advise you to have a look at that presentation, but we will summarise them here. Okay, so the racing rules of sailing. There's lots and lots of rules, but we're not looking at them all. We're only looking at definitions and part 2. In fact, we're only going to be looking at part of part 2 when boats meet. So let's do a summary of the right-of-way rules from part 2, section 2A. A boat has right-of-way over another boat when the other boat is required to keep clear. A boat has to keep clear is governed by 4 basic rules. Rule 10, on opposite tacks, the boat on port keeps clear. Rule 11, on same tack and overlapped, the windward boat keeps clear. Rule 12, boats on the same tack, not overlapped, the boat clear astern keeps clear. And while tacking, the tacking boat keeps clear. Port, windward, astern and tacking keep clear. Pwat is the way I remember that, because pwat is the noise your boat will make if you don't keep clear of another one. Port, windward, astern, tacking. Okay, once we've established who has right-of-way, the right-of-way boat has some limitations, and there are 4 general limitation rules in section 2B. A right-of-way boat must avoid contact if reasonably possible. When acquiring the right-of-way, you shall initially give room. A right-of-way boat that changes course shall give room, and when overtaking to leeward, a right-of-way boat shall not sail above her proper course. I remember these ones with caca, contact, acquiring, changing and above, because you'll be in a lot of caca if you don't know your limitations. Okay, that's the summary of the rights and the limitations. There's a whole other presentation on those rules if you wish to see it, but let's get into the marks and obstruction rules. Rule 18, giving mark room. Rule 19, room to pass an obstruction. And Rule 20, room to tack at an obstruction. So those are the 3 rules we'll be focusing on in this presentation, although we'll deal with them in this order. 19, room to pass an obstruction. Rule 20, to tack an obstruction, and then finally get into the great complexities of giving mark room. Okay, all these rules are as easy as 1, 2, 3 because they all have the same general format and the same way that these rules work. Rules 18, 19 and 20 all have a part 1 which explains when the rule does apply. It'll then have a couple of exceptions when the rule doesn't apply, and there'll be exceptions to the exceptions. These are complex rules. The fundamental point is you must first work out if rule 18, 19 or 20 applies to the situation. So you have to look at point 1 of that rule to see, does the rule apply? It's kind of like a useless box. The rule can switch on, and then the rule itself can switch itself off and says, this rule says I don't apply. Once you know that the rule does apply, you can look at point 2 of the rule to see what the rule does. What does it mean if this rule applies? Except there'll be more exceptions in part 2, and it'll also have a couple of times when it no longer applies. The useless box will come into play and the rule might switch itself off again. But the fundamental approach still applies. We're going to work out, does the rule apply? And then what does the rule mean? And we have to look out for any clauses that might switch the rule off or make the rule not apply. And typically they can be in some of the other sections, point 3, where there's more exceptional cases, and occasionally there's a point 4 with even more exceptional cases. So we also need to look at the definition of what an obstruction is, if we are to give room at one. An object a boat cannot pass without changing course substantially. It's something that you have to move away from or change course so you don't hit it. Pretty obvious. Something designated in the sailing instructions. The sailing instructions might say a particular zone is an obstruction, or a particular line is an obstruction, or maybe you can treat the moorings as an obstruction. So the sailing instructions can define additional obstructions that you must treat as an obstruction. And then, a boat racing is not an obstruction to other boats unless they're required to keep clear of her. Okay, that's a bit difficult language. Let's simplify that a little bit. A boat racing is an obstruction to other boats if they are required to keep clear of her. So a boat you must keep clear of is an obstruction to you. So let's look at Rule 19, room to pass an obstruction. We first look at part 1 of the rule to see when the rule applies. Rule 19 applies between two boats at an obstruction except when the obstruction is a mark, which in this case it isn't, or when Rule 18 applies, which there is no mark and Rule 18 is the mark room rule. So neither of those exceptions apply. However, at a continuing obstruction, which this is not, it's an isolated piece of harbour hardware, so none of the exceptions apply. So Rule 19 applies between red and orange at this obstruction. Okay. How about if that obstruction is also a mark? Well, that's clause A, when the obstruction is a mark. So in that case, Rule 19 doesn't apply and you'll have to use Rule 18. How about if there's a third boat involved here? Well, now there can be potentially multiple obstructions. The big red bit of harbour hardware can be an obstruction to all these boats, but a boat that you have to keep clear of, such as the right-of-way boat here, red, could be an obstruction to blue and orange. Except for the Rule B. 19.1b says when Rule 18 applies between the boats and the obstruction is another boat overlapped with each of them. So in this case, blue can't say to orange, I have an obstruction red, because by 19.1b, Rule 18 applies, the boats are overlapped with each of them. That's an exception. Rule 19 does not apply. And none of the boats can claim the big red marker as an obstruction because it's also a mark. And by Part A, Rule 19 doesn't apply. So in this situation, Rule 19 does not apply. Okay, what about now? If it's a mark, but it's also an island, or the island is the mark. Then we come to the final part. At a continuing obstruction, Rule 19 always applies and Rule 18 does not. So in this case, we're going to look at Rule 19 and not 18 when the mark is an island. And if there is nothing in the water and just the three boats, does Rule 19 apply? Well, obstruction can be a boat that you have to keep clear of. And blue and orange must keep clear of red, because red is the right-of-way boat. So in this situation, Rule 19 will apply to orange and blue as they pass the obstruction, which is red. So the rule does apply in that situation. Now that we know when Rule 19 applies, we can look at 19.2 to see what it means to give room at obstruction. So let's deconstruct this. A right-of-way boat may choose to pass an obstruction on either side. So here we have blue, the right-of-way boat, because orange is overlapped on the same tack to windward. Orange must keep clear of blue, blue is the right-of-way boat. Blue can choose to go either side of this obstruction. If blue goes up here, 19 does apply, but doesn't really need to apply because blue can push orange up as much as she likes because blue is the right-of-way boat. But if blue decides to go this way, then when boats are overlapped, the boat outside shall give the inside boat room. If blue goes this way, she becomes the outside boat and orange is the inside boat. Blue must give her room to pass the obstruction. So let's see what that looks like. Blue has to come down so she doesn't scrape orange off on the obstruction. And around she goes and has given orange lots of room to pass this obstruction. What if another boat comes in here at this point? Red's come steaming in at speed and stuck her nose in between orange and the obstruction. Is she due room at this obstruction? She's the keep clear boat of orange and blue because she's the windward boat overlapped with each of them on the same tack. Well, the right-of-way boats, both blue and orange, have chosen what side of the mark to go to. So when boats are overlapped, the outside boat shall give the inside boat room. there is another caveat, unless unable to do so from the time the overlap began. Well, when red stuck her nose in there, it's possible for blue and orange to come down and give her room, plus there's probably room there already. So from the moment that overlap began, they could give her room. Red is due room at this obstruction. What about now? If the obstruction, rather than being a bit of harbour hardware, is an island? Well, when passing a continuing obstruction, room must exist from the time the overlap was created. So in this case, when red put a nose in here, there is no room. So in this case, when red sticks a nose in, she's not entitled to room at this obstruction because the room didn't exist when she created the overlap. How about now? Sticks a nose in as these two boats are passing a Manly ferry, a big, long, continuing boat. A boat, no matter how long it is never a continuing obstruction by definition. So in this situation, red has stuck a nose in between orange and an obstruction. Orange and blue have to, if they're able to, must give red room at this obstruction. Of course, they might not be able to because there's a whole bunch of other boats down here or another island or something to that extent, in which case, if they were unable to do so from the time the overlap began, they don't have to. And it also applies if the obstruction is, say, another fleet coming the other direction. So if red sticks a nose in here, it's going to be a little bit difficult because these other boats here are going to take some time coming down. Which brings me to my first cheat rule of go round the outside. When in doubt, if you're not an expert in all the intricacies of these rules, then the best thing to do is just go around the outside. Red should have not tried to stick a nose in there. She should have gone outside all the other boats. And I guess if red does stick a nose in there, and all those other boats are going to have to make every bit of effort to give her room, because otherwise there's going to be grief. Round the outside is the good summary rule. We'll see that several times from now. Okay, let's look at the next rule. Room to tack an obstruction. Tacking an obstruction is different to just passing the obstruction, because not only do you need room to do a manoeuvre. So again, we start off by looking at the point 1 part of the rule to see when the rule can apply. Hailing. A boat may hail for room to tack and avoid a boat on the same tack. However, she shall not hail unless substantial course change is required, or B, sailing close hauled or above. Well, it's a little bit complex language, but let's look at it. Substantial course change. Well, if a substantial course change wasn't required, then it wouldn't have been an obstruction by definition. And therefore, it's only really whether she's sailing close hauled or above. So we can change the language a little bit. A boat may hail for room to tack and avoid a boat on the same tack if sailing close hauled or above. Okay, let's look at, does that apply to this example here? We have two boats on the same tack. They're approaching an obstruction. Can blue hail for room to tack at this obstruction? Same tack, sailing close hauled or above. I believe it does apply. In addition, she shall not hail if the obstruction is a mark. This is not a mark. Rule 20 applies to these two boats approaching that island, which means that blue is now able to hail for room to tack, which in Australia at least quite often comes in the form of one boat shouting water, which is not a hail defined in the rules. It's just commonly known that when you shout water, it means you're running out of depth and you need more water. It really applies better to Rule 19, but it's quite often the hail that's used in this situation. Now, the new version of the rules makes it a little bit less strict how you hail, specifically in terms of language. A language other than English may be used for a hail required by the rules, provided that it is reasonable for it to be understood by all boats affected. English is always acceptable. So in Australia, at least, hailing water is probably reasonable for it to be understood that it means I want to tack. But I don't actually think that this new text really allows for it because it's in English. So if I'm in this situation here, I always actually use the word tack. I want room to tack. I need to tack. Have to tack, guys. Room to tack. is the best way of doing it. Okay, what about these two boats coming towards the island? Does Rule 20 apply to them? A boat may hail for room to tack if sailing close hauled or above. Well, these guys aren't sailing close hauled or above, they're coming downwind. So therefore, Rule 20 doesn't apply to them. Rule 19 probably would, because this is an obstruction. Orange is the right-of-way boat, can choose to go this side of it, and she'd have to give blue room to go down the inside, but she doesn't have to give room to blue to tack, which would be silly because she'd go up this way, and she certainly doesn't have to give blue room to jibe, although blue does jibe, she's on starboard and can go that way anyway. So whatever the interaction that happens here, it's got nothing to do with Rule 20, and no hailing for room to tack. Okay, but what about these two boats coming up to an island, which is now a mark? We've added a mark on the island. Well, in addition, she shall not hail if the obstruction is a mark and a boat that is fetching it would be required to change course as a result of the hail. So in this case, orange is fetching the mark, which means she can basically sail to it and round the mark. So 20.1 says that blue may not hail for room to tack in this situation because it's a mark and orange is fetching it. So in this situation, blue is in a world of pain, hasn't really got anywhere to go, but we'll see how that plays out in a second. What about this situation? Still there's a mark, which orange is fetching, but now we have another boat coming in here. So luckily for blue, green, the starboard tack boat, blue is required to keep clear of her, so green is an obstruction to blue. So Rule 20 applies to blue and orange at the obstruction which is green, and blue can hail for room to tack because of green and nothing to do with the island or the mark. Okay, now that we've understood when Rule 20 applies, we can see what it means when it applies. So we look at Rule 20.2, responding to a hail. After a boat hails, she shall give a hailed boat time to respond. So once blue has hailed for room to tack, she can't just immediately tack over. She has to give orange time to respond in one way or another. And that may be considerable time because there might be another boat outside of her that she has to communicate to, and so on and so forth. So this means that blue has to be reasonable about when they give their hail, and they may have to have given their hail a little bit earlier if there's a lot of boats that they wish to make tack. What about in this situation where we've seen that the island is a mark and blue is not entitled to hail for room to tack when the obstruction is a mark? A hailed boat shall respond even if the hail breaks Rule 20.1. So this requires a response of 20.2 even if blue wasn't allowed to hail. And that response has to be a little bit more than protest. It may well include protesting that blue has broken 20.1, but orange still must meet her obligations under 20.2 because B says that she has to. So therefore, a hail boat shall respond by tacking as soon as possible, getting out of the way, or by immediately replying, "You tack," and giving the hailed boat room to tack, probably coming down a little bit, making sure that once she tacks, she has room to do her tack. So she has to do that. She has to do one or the other, even if blue wasn't entitled to hail for room to tack. She can protest her if she doesn't like it, but she has to give her respond so blue doesn't run into the island. Once orange has responded, either by tacking or by saying "you tack," then the hail boat shall tack as soon as possible. Blue can't suddenly get a wonder lift and come up over here without tacking. Once she's hailed for room to tack and has received a response, she must tack as soon as possible. And from the moment she hails for room to tack until she has tacked, Rule 18 doesn't apply anymore. So well done, that's rules 19 and 20, passing obstruction and tacking obstruction. We're now going to look at rule 18, mark room. You might want to pause the video here and have a bit of a break because mark roundings can be very complex, specifically starboard roundings, which Manly Yacht Club does a lot. Or your right-of-way rules may apply, 10, 11, 12, 13, opposite tacks, windward boat, clear astern, while tacking, especially if you have to tack at the mark. And most of your limitation rules will apply as well. You have to avoid contact, will be acquiring rights, and it may have to give room. You may be changing course as a right-of-way boat and may have to give room. And then on top of that, we actually have Rule 18. But remember, Rule 18 is as easy as 1, 2, 3. 18.1, when Rule 18 applies. 18.2, what it means to give mark room. 18.3, one of the exceptions of tacking in the zone. And 18.4, jibing in the zone. Okay, there's an extra exception. So let's get into it. 18.1. Rule 18 applies between boats when they are required to leave a mark on the same side and at least one of them is in the zone, 3 boat lengths from the mark. However, it does not apply, the exceptions, between boats on opposite tacks on a beat to windward, between boats on opposite tacks when the proper course at the mark for one but not both of them is to tack, between a boat approaching a mark and one leaving it, or if the mark is a continuing obstruction, in which case Rule 19 applies. And then Rule 18 no longer applies, it switches off, between boats when mark room has been given. So let's look at some examples. Here we have 2 boats, blue and green. Green is the keep clear boat because she is overlapped on the same tack to windward. Blue is the right-of-way boat and they're heading up towards this mark. Does Rule 18 apply between these 2 boats? Well, in this case, no, it does not, because at least one of them is not in the zone. Neither of these boats is in the zone marked here. Okay, if they progress a little bit, does Rule 18 apply to them now? Blue has reached the zone. She's in the zone. I believe it does because none of these exceptions apply to these 2 boats. They're not on opposite tacks. No one's leaving the mark, and the mark's not a continued obstruction, and no one's given mark room yet. So to these 2 boats, Rule 18 does apply. Alright, these 2 boats approaching the mark. Well, that's easy. It doesn't apply because these 2 boats are on a beat to windward and they're on opposite tacks. What about these 2 boats? They're also on opposite tacks. Well, it's not a beat to windward. They're coming downwind around this mark. And also, when the proper course at the mark for one but not both is to tack. Well, I don't think either of them is tacking here. There's probably a bit of jibing going on, but I don't think there's any tacking happening at this mark. So in this case, Rule 18 does apply to these 2 boats. What about these 2 boats on opposite tacks coming up to the mark? We now have an indication that they've actually come in from over here and they're going back out that way. It's sort of like a reaching mark. Well, Rule 18 doesn't apply between boats on opposite tacks on a beat to windward. Well, this isn't a beat to windward. They've reached in here. The course wasn't up to windward, it was a reaching course. Purple seems to have overstood it a little bit, but the course was a reach. So exclusion A doesn't apply. Between boats on opposite tacks when the proper course at the mark for one but not both of them is to tack. So these boats are on opposite tacks and the proper course to go this way is for one of them, orange, to tack, but not for purple to tack. So clause B applies here. These boats are on opposite tacks and orange has to tack at the mark, but purple doesn't. So therefore, by that exclusion, Rule 18 doesn't apply in this case. It's just a simple port starboard. It's as if the mark didn't exist. What about these 2 boats? Well, this is the case where one boat is approaching the mark and the other boat is leaving it. So no matter what, Rule 18 is not going to apply between these 2 boats, even if they're on opposite tacks or whatever. Okay, here we have 2 boats approaching the zone, does Rule 18 apply to these two boats? Well, we're going to get into what exactly the zone means. Zone, the area around a mark within a distance of 3 hull lengths of the boat nearer to it. So while we've been using this circle to mark the zone, in this case, this great big boat here is nearer to the mark than green. So it's 3 of her hull lengths defines the zone. And therefore the zone is actually out over here. And in this case, these two boats have been in the zone for some time, and Rule 18 will apply to them. However, in this situation, where green's bow forward of blue, green is now the closest boat to the mark. It's green's hull length that defines the zone, and these two boats aren't in the zone, and Rule 18 does not yet apply to them. Finally, this situation here, the mark's an island. Blue, the right-of-way boat, has reached the zone. Does Rule 18 apply? No, this is Clause D. If a mark is a continuing obstruction, Rule 19 applies. 18 doesn't apply to go around this mark. We have to look at Rule 19, which we've already covered. Great. Now that we've looked at 18.1 to know when Rule 18 applies, we have to look at all this text here to see what it means to give mark room. So let's start with 18.2 Clause A. When boats are overlapped, the outside boat shall give the inside boat mark room. Unless. Well, that's a good place to stop. If you don't want to know any more detail, you can just say the outside boat shall give the inside boat mark room. The old golden round the outside rule. If you think mark room applies, go round the outside. If the boat gets inside of you, give them room. We will go into all the details of these rules later, but round the outside is a good simplification. So, in order to know how to give mark room, we have to know what the definition of mark room is. And again, we have a lot more text here to understand. Mark room is room, which we know is the space a boat needs to meet her obligations, to leave a mark on the required side. Also, to sail to the mark, to round or past the mark, and all the text at the bottom says does not include room to tack unless she is overlapped inside and to windward. We can simplify that one. Mark room does include room to tack if she is overlapped inside to windward. Okay, mark room, leave the mark on the required side, sail to the mark, round or past the mark, and room to tack if she is overlapped inside and to windward. Let's look at some examples to see what that means. Here we have two boats. Does 18 apply? Well, at least one of them is in the zone, so they're both on the same tack. Rule 18 applies. Green is the keep clear boat, blue is the right of way boat, blue is inside to green, so therefore blue is due mark room by 18.2, which means green must go around the outside. Green must give blue mark room. Even though she hasn't quite laid it, there's nothing in the rule that says blue has to be above the lay line. So therefore, green must give blue room to sail to the mark. In this case, blue's sailing a little bit high and slow, losing a bit of ground to green, but green has to allow her to do that. She would have had to do that anyway because she's the keep clear boat, but 18 underlines that. We get to this point here, she has the room to sail around the mark, which for blue is it going to be a big hero luff to shoot the mark and get around it, and green has to give her room to do that. Again, she probably had to do that as keep clear boat anyway. And around she goes, and green's gone around the outside, given a blue mark room, and everybody's happy. Okay, starboard rounding. Similar sort of circumstance. Blue has just reached the zone. Blue is the right-of-way boat because green must keep clear of her as boat on the same tack, windward, overlapped. So in this case, blue owes green mark room because green is inside of blue, has established an overlap. So therefore blue can't sail straight to the mark, she has to allow green to sail to the mark, even though blue is the right-of-way boat and normally could have sailed higher. She has to allow green to round the mark and to tack at the mark, because mark room includes room to tack if you are overlapped inside windward boat, which green is. So green is allowed to tack and a bum can swing out here, and blue has to give her room to do so, even though she soon will be the tacking boat and must keep clear. So now she's tacking, blue still keeping clear, going round the outside, round the outside, round the outside, bearing away, everybody's happy. Now we're going to dive into 18.2 clauses B, C and E. All that text we alighted out with around the outside. 18.2b. If boats are overlapped when the first of them reaches the zone, the outside boat at that moment shall thereafter give the inside boat mark room. If a boat is clear ahead when she reaches the zone, the boat clearest stern at that moment shall thereafter give her mark room. So at the moment a boat reaches the zone, if an overlap does exist or doesn't exist, that situation perpetuates thereafter. So let's look how clause B applies to these boats down here. Well, if boats are overlapped when the first of them reaches the zone, well, it's hard to say because blue's been in the zone for some time, green is half in the zone, so she reached it a few seconds ago. So we don't really know the situation when the first of them reach the zone. When we have the need to interpret 18.2b, we need to look at when the first of them reach the zone. So we have to turn back time. So turning back time in this case is to when blue first entered the zone. And we can look at the situation now. So when the first of them reaches the zone, the outside boat at that moment shall thereafter give the inside boat mark room. So we're looking at the moment that blue, is she the outside boat? Is there an overlap here? Well, it's really hard to tell. At that moment, green's bow was very close to blue's stern and orange's bow was very close to green's stern. I can't really say if there's an overlap here or not. So 18.2e says if there is reasonable doubt that a boat obtained or broke an overlap, she did not. So this is the clause we can use to remove any of the doubt that may exist. And the way it works, it talks about breaking or obtaining an overlap. So again, we can't just look at a snapshot here, we have to look at the dynamics of what's happening. And to look at the dynamics, we have to turn back time a little bit more. And look, what was the dynamics here? So the situation we're trying to look at is from here to there, that situation. Did orange obtain an overlap? Did blue break the overlap with green? We look back here and there is no overlap with orange and green, but there is one with blue and green. So at this point of time, we resolve the doubt by saying, because there is doubt that blue broke the overlap with green, she did not. Because there is doubt that orange established an overlap with green, she did not. So for the purposes of Rule 18, this is the situation we look at, where there is no doubt. Orange didn't have an overlap with green, green did have an overlap with blue, and orange didn't have an overlap with blue. 18.2c, when a boat is required to give mark room, she shall continue to do so even if later an overlap is broken or a new overlap begins. So this clause here is stressing the shall thereafter give her mark room part. So in this situation, this is what we determine happens the moment blue hits the zone. From thereafter, even if orange establishes an overlap or blue breaks the overlap with green, it doesn't change how mark room is due. So in this case, green can start shouting, blue, give me room because I had an overlap, and orange, there's no room in there because you didn't have an overlap. Of course, it would be much better if blue started communicating that rather than yelling well before the zone. because this is where we're going to be looking to remove any doubt about when you hit the zone. Zones are very difficult to judge in the water. 3 boat lengths of another boat can be very difficult to judge. So the best thing to do is to take it at the moment when there is no doubt. As you're approaching where the zone might be, it's clear to green that she's ahead of orange. She can shout then, "No room, orange, don't go in there. Go around the outside." She can say to blue, "My nose is in here, give me room. Don't start sailing high, you owe me room to get to the mark." And both these boats will conclude that, well, there's certainly no doubt that there's an overlap here and the clear stern here. So probably when we get to the zone, that will be the situation that will be determined to hold. Another 18.2 clause F. If a boat obtained an inside overlap from clear astern or by tacking to windward of the other boat, and from the time the overlap began, the outside boat has been unable to give mark room, she is not required to give it. So here's blue. Looks like very soon she'll get mark room, technically get mark room on green when green first hits the zone. But even though they're outside the zone at the moment, when blue established her overlap on green, because she did it from astern and behind, green is unable to give her mark room because of all these other boats out here. So if those boats don't come down, green will not have broken rule 18 because she was unable to give blue mark room. Perhaps light blue will have broken 18 by not coming down with all the communications through there, but there could be reasons, such as islands here, that means that this group of boats just can't give blue room from the moment she established the overlap. So 18 to F basically allows these boats not to have to do the impossible. If the room doesn't exist, they don't have to give it. Okay, now we've looked a little bit at what it means to give mark room. We can go back to 18.1 and look at that last clause. Rule 18 no longer applies between boats when mark room has been given. This is when the rule switches off. How long do you have to give mark room? And this seems a little bit obvious. You don't have to give mark room once you've given mark room, but that means we have to understand what it means to give mark room. And so we know that means you can sail to the mark and that you can round the mark. But has orange rounded the mark? Well, round the mark as necessary to sail the course. So to determine if orange has rounded the mark in this situation, and specifically this is asking, can orange jibe here? We need to know where the next mark is. So if the next mark is down here, then orange has rounded the mark. She's headed towards the mark. Now tactically she might want to jibe onto port and go this way, but mark room doesn't allow her to do so. She's sailing the course. Blue can hold her out, take her out this way as long as she likes. But if the next mark's over here, and we can see some ley lines there, then orange is not sailing towards the mark. She's outside the ley lines. To sail the course, she has to jibe to get to that mark. And so in this case, orange has not yet rounded the mark as necessary to sail the course. And so even though she's the keep clear boat on blue, blue must give her mark room and allow her to jibe to sail the course. Okay, 18.3, one of our exceptional cases. This has actually been renamed to 18.3, passing head to wind in the zone. But I think everyone's going to just call it tacking in the zone. If a boat in the zone of a mark to be left to port passes head to wind from port to starboard and is then fetching the mark, she shall not cause a boat that has been on starboard tack since entering the zone to sail above a close-hauled course. So what 18.3 is saying is that if green here is on starboard coming in and is fetching the mark and could have gone around, blue is not entitled to come in and do a lee bow tack. Lee bow tacks can sometimes force the starboard boat to luff up a little bit and not break a rule. But if 18 applies to them, in this situation, blue is not allowed to do a last-minute hero lee bow tack and force green to go above her close-hauled course. Furthermore, even if blue gets across green and then tacks, 18.3 says that once she has passed head to wing, she shall give mark room if that boat becomes overlapped inside her. So she's got across, she's tacked. Now green's got her nose inside there. Now blue owes green mark room and must go around the outside and allow green to go around the mark. 18.4, jibing in the zone. Here we have two boats on opposite tacks going to a mark, but because they're downwind and neither of them is going to tack, 18 does apply to them. 18.4, when an inside overlapped right-of-way boat must jibe at a mark to sail her proper course. Until she jibes, she shall sail no further from the mark than needed to sail that course. So here we have green on starboard, yellow on port. Green is owed mark room by yellow, but that doesn't mean that she can keep sailing all the way out here and take yellow miles away from the mark, because 18.4 says if she's required to jibe at the mark to sail the course, and she is, then she must jibe at the mark and sail no further on. So she's got to go around. However, Rule 18.4 doesn't apply at a gate mark. If there's another mark here and green can go around here or around there, then 18.4 doesn't apply. Green can go around either one, or she can sail straight on, and yellow just has to live with it. Of course, if green decides to go around the far mark, she's going to force yellow into a jibe, and then we have a whole new zone that we're going to come to, and yellow may well be the inside boat when we get to this zone, and therefore green may end up owing yellow mark room at this gate mark over here. So this lame joke indicates that we've looked at rules 18, 19 and 20, all the rules we want to consider during this presentation. If you think you've got it, you can go, but we're going to look at a lot more nuances of those rules in a few examples. By all means, stay with us and let's look at some of those examples. So tacking in the zone on a mark we leave to starboard. We saw earlier that 18.3 was a special rule about tacking in the zone for a mark we left to port. So what does it mean if you tack in the zone for a mark you have to leave to starboard? Does Rule 18 say anything about this? Well, Rule 18 doesn't apply to boats on opposite tacks on a beat to windward in this case. So therefore, 18 doesn't apply. It's as if there was no mark. Blue is the right-of-way boat by Rule 10. She's on starboard, and green on port must keep clear of her. So blue can sail as she likes and then tack and go away. So long as green keeps clear, which she has done with the luff, all's fine. Rule 10 applies while blue's changing course. 16 applies while blue's tacking. 13 applies. It's just our normal rules. However, in some situations, 18 can apply. Here we have blue on starboard coming to a mark, green's on port. So initially, there's no mark. It's just a starboard boat approaching a port boat. Port must keep clear of starboard. 18 doesn't apply because they're on opposite tacks on a beat to windward. So blue gets across green and tacks. So now we have two boats on the same tack. They're no longer on opposite tacks. And Rule 18 says at least one of them is in the zone. Well, we saw where the mark was. They're both in the zone. And they're not on opposite tacks, so A and B exclusions don't happen. Neither of them is leaving the mark. C doesn't happen, and the mark wasn't a continuing obstruction. So Rule 18 does apply now. When boats are overlapped, the outside boat shall give the inside boat mark room. Blue now is the outside boat and must give green mark room. So blue can't round the mark like this and calls green all sorts of grief. By Rule 11, blue must keep clear of green, and by Rule 18, blue must give green mark room. There are more limitations on mark room. Here we have two boats. Blue is clear ahead of green when she reaches the zone. So therefore, green owes blue mark room. Blue is able to sail to the mark, luffing up here, trying to get close to the mark. But she's not entitled to tack to get to the mark, because by definition, mark room does not include room to tack unless you are overlapped inside to windward, and blue in this case was outside green. So blue thinks she can tack and go around the mark, but she's wrong. In this situation, the mark room that green owes to blue doesn't include room to tack. And even if it did, when blue tacks by 18.2d, rule 18 ceases to apply. So now she's just the tacking boat. By rule 13, she must keep clear of green. Even when she finishes a tack, she's now on port and green's on starboard. So by rule 10, she must keep clear of green. But there's a little complication. If blue was actually ahead of green, then green can't start rounding the mark, as the right-of-way boat is obliged not to change course to prevent blue from keeping clear. This can cause a lot of difficulty when unpicking a situation. Both these scenarios are very similar. Blue is clear ahead of green. Green owes blue mark room. Blue is tacking to round the mark in both situations. But in the situation on the left, blue is just tacked in front of green with no rights to do so, because mark room doesn't give her the right to tack in this situation. And so she's not kept clear either by rule 13 while tacking or rule 10 once onto port. But in the situation on the right, blue was able to tack and cross green and is only not kept clear because green changed course. But these two situations look very, very similar. And even worse, if once the collision became apparent, green puts in a crash tack to try and avoid the collision. Any protest committee unpicking this is going to have to look at exactly where the contact was to try and work out which boat is to be disqualified. Because of these limitations, it can result in some very silly tactics. The starboard boat here is aware that if she tacks the mark and green establishes an overlap inside her, she may have to give her room. So she might hunt green a little bit to force her to tack away before she rounds the mark, and force green into attack, and then they both go around the mark like this. Which is great, blue on green, but it's a horrible course for both of them to sail, and they're both lost out to the fleet. So a much better tactic is for green to realise that while she may have some rights if she gets her nose inside blue, that blue at the moment has the rights over her and can sail to take her out or avoid that situation. So if green just makes it clear to blue that she's not going to do anything silly and stick a nose in there, then blue can go around the mark as she likes, green can follow her, they don't lose anything on the fleet. It's a much better way to get around a mark. Okay, we have similar sort of problems. If you're reaching into a mark, here we have two boats, they've reached the zone, they are overlapped on the same tack. Blue must give green mark room. Blue is the right-of-way boat, green is the keep clear boat. In they come to the mark. Blue must give room for green to sail to the mark, but she doesn't have to give her room to do a tactical rounding to let her go in wide and out tight. So green basically has to sail to the mark and then round it, and she might go a little bit wide and could open the door. So blue can slow up a little bit here, go a little bit wide, and get a nose in there to try and get above green. So at this point of time, has now blue given green mark room? Is rule 18 over? Well, it depends a little bit on where the next mark is. Let's say the next mark's up there. Has green rounded the mark? I believe so. She's heading upwind towards the next mark. She might want to go on to port, to go out the right side for better wind, but nothing in rule 18 allows her to do so. So in this case, blue's given the mark room, the mark no longer exists, and it's just two boats sailing on the same tack. Blue is clear astern of green, blue must keep clear of green. But that doesn't entitle green to tack in front of her. If green tacks, she's still constrained by rule 13 and eventually 10 to keep clear of blue. So therefore blue can take green as far as she likes, off to the left side of the course, after rounding that mark. Let's look at mark room downwind. Okay, we have 5 boats coming into this mark here, they have to round to starboard. Does 18 apply to these boats? Well, it does, because the first of them has reached the zone. They are on opposite tacks, some of the pairs are on opposite tacks, but they're not on a beat to windward, and there's no one tacking at this mark, no one's leaving the mark, and the mark's not a continuing obstruction. So 18 does apply, and we can start looking to see who's overlapped with who. So in this situation, it's good to remember the definition of overlap. These terms apply to boats on opposite tacks only when Rule 18 applies between them, or when both boats are sailing more than 90 degrees from the true wind. So in this case, 18 is probably going to apply between these boats, and they're all sailing more than 90 degrees. So we can look at the overlaps between them. Here we have red is definitely overlapped with blue and orange, and it's difficult to tell whether she is with yellow, maybe, maybe not. We'd have to roll back time to see whether that's going to hold. But she's definitely clear ahead of green. We have blue is overlapped with orange, but green and yellow are definitely clear behind her, and blue overlaps with red because neither is clear astern. Now when red reaches the zone, green's still definitely behind her, and yellow is still a little bit indeterministic, so we still don't know between red and yellow. When they've sailed to the mark, what mark room is due? Red owes mark room to orange and blue because they were inside her when they reached the zone. But we don't really know whether red owes mark room to yellow because we didn't go far enough back in time to see whether yellow was establishing an overlap or whether red was breaking one. Blue definitely owes mark room to orange because they were overlapped when orange reached the zone. Yellow owes mark room to blue and orange because she was clear astern of them when they reached the zone. But we don't really know the relationship with red. Green owes mark room to everybody because they are either inside her or clear ahead of her when the zone was reached. But the question here is, even though green owes mark room to red, can red keep green out from the mark? What's to stop green and yellow following these other two boats around the mark? What can red do here? Well, firstly, can they go around the mark? Can yellow sail on past? Well, yellow's on port, so she has to keep clear. So any rights that yellow have is due to mark room, and she basically can only sail to the mark and round the mark. But is yellow an obstruction for green? Can green say to red, if red calls green up, I can't because I've got an obstruction, a boat that I must give mark room to? Well, no, because 19.1 applies. When the obstruction is another boat overlap with each of them, and Rule 18 applies, Rule 19 doesn't apply. So there's nothing in the rules to stop red trying to keep green out, other than the fact that blue and orange are there, and she has to give them room. Green is following in that room that red is giving to blue and orange. And so she has to go around the outside like this, and green's got inside her. So now red's dead last. Can she protest green because green wasn't due that mark room? I don't think so, because green didn't stop red sailing to the mark. It was blue and orange stopped red sailing to the mark because red owed them mark room. Green was just sailing in that room that was made available. Now, if red really wants to get bent out of shape and keep green out, she could have slowed up, broke the overlap with blue and orange, and then come up hard to keep green out from the mark. But in process, she's going to push yellow out, and we don't know the situation between red and yellow. Yellow may have had mark room over red. So in order to assert her rights over green, red may infringe against another boat and end up in a world of pain. So this is another great example of the golden rule round the outside. Red has to go around the outside in this situation, nothing much else she can do. If red doesn't want to go around the outside, then she should have taken the inside long ago. She should have jibed way up here and approached with orange and yellow. Okay, that's marks and obstructions. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, greg@nyc.org.au. Thanks for staying with me for that complex presentation. she shall cease. She shall say until she until she jibes. She shall until she jibes. She